In 2013, the Virginia General Assembly enacted legislation to enhance school safety by providing for threat assessment teams to support every Virginia public school. In accordance with that Virginia law, the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety, or VCSCS, under the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, or DCJS, created model policies and procedures in threat assessment in Virginia public schools, model policies, procedures, and guidelines to help local school boards establish and operate threat assessment teams to support their schools. While the legislation does not mandate any particular approach, the model policies provide guidance based on a review of accepted practice and research developed by the DCJS. However, the school division policies must be consistent with the model policies developed by the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety in accordance with 22.1-79.4, which were developed in response to 9.1-184. The DCJS model is a synthesis of best practices in threat assessment and adheres to required legislation. The model is available for use, free of charge, for both public and private schools in Virginia as needed. Threat assessment in Virginia falls under the umbrella of the Virginia Cares for Schools and Campuses program, which was developed in 2016 to illustrate initiatives by the VCSCS to support schools and campuses in enhancing school safety and supporting the programs in place across the Commonwealth. The CARES program stands for C for Caring and Connection to build a positive school climate. A for Awareness of resources. R for recognition of aberrant and threatening behaviors. E for engagement with the community and with persons for whom there is concern. And S for support, supporting each other.
This school threat assessment information was developed through DCJS to supplement the DCJS model policies, procedures, and guidelines. The objectives of this video are to help Virginia schools, divisions, parents, and community members understand school threat assessment, facilitate the work of threat assessment teams, and identify action steps for recognizing threatening behavior to prevent violence and assist persons in need.
A threat is a concerning communication or behavior that suggests a person may intend harm to self or others. The threat may be spoken, written, or gestured. It may be observed by or communicated directly to the target of the threat, or it may be observed by or communicated to a third party. The target of the threat does not need to be aware of the threat existing in any fashion, whether orally, visually, in writing, or electronically. Threat assessment is in all public K12 schools and college campuses in Virginia. Threat assessment in Virginia is a fact-based process relying primarily on an appraisal of behaviors to identify potentially dangerous or violent situations and to address them. There are certain assumptions that provide rationale for the school threat assessment model. These assumptions come from major research on school shootings and on other acts of targeted violence, as well as research on threat assessment. The principles that govern threat assessment are derived from decades of research and practice in assessing and managing threatening situations. K12 schools are the primary focus of this video. For additional information on threat assessment related to institutions of higher education, please go to the DCJS website.
A threat assessment focuses principally upon the following 4 factors: identifying persons whose behavior is threatening, aberrant, or concerning, gathering information and investigating the situation, assessing the person and the situation, and managing the person and situation to prevent violence and mitigate risk of harm. 80% or more of threat assessments in schools are determined to be threat to self. The threat assessment process works on core findings from research on intentional violence occurring in schools, including the fact that, prior to such incidents, others usually knew of a perpetrator's ideas, plans, or preparations. Most perpetrators did not threaten their targets directly prior to the act of violence. Most perpetrators had significant difficulties with losses or failures. There are no accurate or useful profiles for a person who engages in targeted violence in schools. School-based attacks are rarely sudden or impulsive acts, and despite prompt law enforcement response, Most incidents were stopped by other means and were short in duration. This process addresses the question, is the person on a pathway to violence? The threat assessment process is not designed to be adversarial or punitive, but a fair, objective, reasonable, and timely approach to prevent violence or harm to self or others. A critical aspect of this process involves school community members reporting any potential threats in a timely and accurate manner. The team's goal is to maintain the safety of all persons involved, while also connecting the potential person posing the threat with appropriate intervention.
Multidisciplinary teams conduct the threat assessment process. The superintendent of each school division must establish a threat assessment team to serve each school. However, teams may work with one or more schools. Together, these individuals should also be able to adequately evaluate and manage a potential threat.
Communication is essential to the overall effectiveness of school threat assessment teams. As such, all parties must share timely information. Teams will implement the policies adopted by the school board and report quantitative data on its activities through the annual school safety audit process. Essential items to consider in the creation of an effective threat assessment team include developing basic procedures and guidelines, or the utilization of the DCJS model, conducting threat assessment training to include tabletop exercises, consulting with legal counsel, keeping records and tracking data, communicating with parents and the community, and forging partnerships with mental health and community support resources.
The 2013 Immunity from Civil Liability Law expands current Virginia law by extending civil immunity to any person who acts to report, investigate, or cause any investigation to be made into the activities of any person or persons as they relate to conduct involving bomb threats, firebombs, explosive materials, or other similar devices, or alcohol or drug use or abuse in or related to the school or institution, or information that an individual poses any credible danger of serious bodily injury or death to one or more students, school personnel, or others on school property, shall be immune from all civil liability as the result of the making of such a report, investigation, or disclosure. Communication is therefore the cornerstone of effective threat management.
It is recommended that each school's threat assessment team participate in ongoing training, including meeting regularly together to discuss and enhance the threat assessment process and procedures. It is also suggested that the team regularly use practice scenarios to build skills and effectiveness of the threat assessment process in order to have a unified understanding of how the team will work together in completing the threat assessment process. Training varies from locality to locality. Free training will be provided by DCJS as resources allow.
When a potential threat comes to the threat assessment team, it is their job to determine not only if a threat has been made or communicated, but also if the person poses a danger to self or others, or is on a pathway to violence. A threat may involve threatening statements to others or behaviors that are threatening, aberrant, or concerning. The team then implements a strategy to continue to assess, monitor, and manage the case. The goal of the threat assessment process is the safety of the school community, ensuring that a range of strategies such as mentoring, counseling, support, confrontation, addressing inappropriate behavior and setting reasonable boundaries, termination of employment, or an arrest or prosecution are used in a measured and appropriate manner. The ultimate objective is to prevent violence before it occurs.
A pathway to violence to others often follows 4 steps: ideation or expressed thoughts of the use of violence to address a perceived grievance, planning as to how to implement that violence, preparation for violence including acquisition of means, method, and opportunity, and the implementation of violence. The guiding principles which result from these findings center around the basic tenet that targeted school violence is the end result of an understandable and often discernible process of thinking and behavior which the threat assessment team, with the right training and processes, can identify and act upon.
Has the person shown inappropriate interest, fascination, or fixation, indicating an identification with any of the following? Incidents of mass violence such as terrorism, school or workplace violence, or mass murderers? Weapons used in such incidents, including recent acquisition of any relevant weapons? Specific perpetrators of mass violence such as terrorism, workplace violence, or mass murderers? Particular grievances or motivations for the use of violence, and obsessive pursuit, stalking, or monitoring others. A yes to any of these circumstances does not necessarily indicate the person in question poses a threat or is otherwise in need of some assistance. Many people are interested in these topics but never pose any threat. However, if a person shows some fascination or fixation on any of these topics and has raised concern in another way, such as expressing an idea to do harm to others or to themselves, recently purchasing a weapon, or showing an attitude of helplessness or despair, the combination of these facts should increase the team's concern about the person in question. Has the person engaged in attack-related behaviors, that is, any behavior that moves an idea of harm forward toward actual harm? Does the person have the capacity to carry out an act of targeted violence? Is the person experiencing hopelessness, desperation, and/or despair? Does the person have loss of a trusted person or isolation from support systems? Does the person see violence as an acceptable, desirable, or the only way to solve problems? Is the person's conversation and story consistent with their actions? Are other people concerned about the person's potential for violence? What circumstances might affect the likelihood of violence?
Where an immediate threat to life or physical safety exists, reports must result in an immediate notification to law enforcement. Aberrant behavior is that which is atypical for the person or situation and causes concern for the safety or well-being of those involved. Aberrant behavior for an individual involves out-of-character responses or actions, which could lead to violence. These can include unusual social distancing or isolation of individuals from peers and family members, sullen or depressed behavior from an otherwise friendly and positive person, out-of-context outbursts of verbal or physical aggression, increased levels of agitation, frustration, and anger, confrontational, accusatory, or blaming behavior, an unusual interest in weapons, and fixation on violence as means of addressing a grievance. If an individual exhibits out-of-character behaviors, then witnesses should seek to respond in a reasonable, fair, timely, and systematic manner to help teams to identify signs that a person may be on a pathway to violence, ensuring that appropriate measures are taken before violence occurs. Community members may report concerns to threat assessment team members, school administrators, teachers, or the school resource officer.
The threat assessment process follows the following key steps. Step 1. Notification of a threat. People with concerns should notify the threat assessment team, school administrators or teachers, or law enforcement about the nature of the concerns. All members of the community have a responsibility to each other to share concerns for the safety and well-being of the community or any of its members. When a report is made, the threat assessment team will initiate a fact-finding process, which would include the details of the threatening or aberrant behavior, any witnesses to contribute to the fact-finding efforts, information regarding the background and circumstances of the person alleged to be engaging in threatening or aberrant behavior, information regarding the targets of the threat, other people in the school who have first-hand experiences with the person of concern, such as a coach or music director or work colleague, and preservation and documentation of any threatening communication or behaviors. Step 2. Information gathering. Step 3. Analysis of information. Step 4. Assessing the threat. If the threat assessment team believes that the person poses a threat, then they will develop and implement a plan to respond to the threat and so manage and reduce the risk. Step 5. Make the assessment.
The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, should not be an impediment to an effective threat assessment nor to case management. FERPA protects students' educational records only, rather than observations and direct communications. School administrators, teachers, and other staff may share information, including educational records, with other school officials that have a need to know the information. This includes the members of the threat assessment team. Where safety concerns exist, schools can share information with others outside the school, such as with parents, law enforcement officials, and mental health professionals that can help address the safety concerns. Virginia law requires school divisions to establish threat assessment teams, accompanying policy and reporting protocols using the DCJS or compatible model as the best practice for school violence prevention. The goal of DCJS is to ensure that the threat assessment teams in Virginia schools and institutions of higher education have the best guidance, resources, training, and information possible in order to protect our students and communities from threats of violence. Schools in Virginia are committed to maintaining the safety of all students, staff, and visitors. It is the responsibility of the threat assessment teams and the school boards they serve to ensure that the policies, protocols, assessments, training, and ultimately reporting and management of potential threats is effective, articulated, and critically sustained.
Further information can be found at the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety and Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services appreciate your partnership in keeping schools safe.